Millionaire's mother disguised herself as a housekeeper. What she saw about her daughter-in-law shattered her. Dorothy Calloway stepped out of the rideshare with a small rolling suitcase in one hand and a knot in her chest that made it hard to breathe properly. She stood on the sidewalk in Buckhead, the wealthiest neighborhood in Atlanta, Georgia, staring up at a massive iron gate. Beyond it rose a house with white columns, floor-to-ceiling windows catching the late afternoon sun like mirrors, and perfectly trimmed hedges lining the front walk like soldiers at attention. Magnolia trees stood at the corners of the property, ancient and formal, as if they had been placed there to impress rather than to give shade. For a long moment she did not move, because crossing that gate meant letting go of who she was. It meant setting aside Dorothy Calloway, setting aside Ethan's mother, setting aside the grandmother of Lily and Noah. From this moment forward, she would be someone else entirely. She would be Ruth, a housekeeper sent by a staffing agency in Midtown. A woman without history, without standing, without a voice of her own. She smoothed the plain gray apron she had put on in the back seat during the drive over. She tucked a strand of silver hair beneath the cotton kerchief she had tied low on her head, and she walked toward the front door with her late husband Earl's pocket watch pressed deep inside the front pocket of the apron. She never went anywhere without it. She had carried it since the day they put Earl in the ground 12 years ago, and she was not about to stop now. She rang the doorbell. The sound disappeared into the house the way a stone drops into still water. A long minute passed. Then 2. And then the door swung open. Claire was standing in the doorway with her arms folded across her chest and a white linen dress that probably cost more than Dorothy spent on groceries in 2 months. She did not smile. She did not say hello. She looked Dorothy up and down with the calm, assessing expression of someone inspecting a piece of furniture that had been delivered and was trying to decide if it would do. "You must be the new one," Claire said. Not a question, a declaration. Dorothy lowered her gaze the way she had seen housekeepers do in the movies she watched on Sunday evenings back home in Franklin, Tennessee. "Yes, ma'am. My name is Ruth. The agency sent me." Claire was already turning away, her heels clicking against the marble floor of the entryway in a sharp, rhythmic pattern that lodged itself immediately in Dorothy's memory. Dorothy followed her inside, and as she moved through the long hallway lined with framed artwork that looked like it belonged in a gallery, she noticed something that sent a chill through her, despite the late Georgia heat outside. The house was enormous. It was beautiful. It had been decorated with the kind of careful precision that meant a professional had been involved, but it was utterly silent. No children's voices, no laughter, no small feet on the floor. No one calling out for a snack or arguing over the television. Just the echo of Claire's heels and the distant hum of the air conditioning system. Dorothy thought a house where 2 young children live should never sound like this. It should sound like life. It should sound like chaos and joy and someone complaining about broccoli. But this house sounded like a doctor's waiting room. It sounded like an empty office building on a Sunday afternoon. It sounded like a place where no one really wanted to be. Claire stopped in front of a door at the far end of the hallway, just off the kitchen. "This is your room," she said, without turning around. "Work begins at 6 in the morning and ends at 10 at night. You do not offer opinions. You do not engage with the children beyond what is necessary for their care. If they need something, you come to me first. Is that understood?" Dorothy gripped the handle of her suitcase until her knuckles went white. "Yes, ma'am. Understood." Claire left without another word. Dorothy opened the door to the staff quarters and stepped inside slowly. It was small, a single bed pushed against the wall, a bare light bulb hanging from the ceiling with no shade, a narrow window that faced the back of the property where a perfectly landscaped yard sat empty and still in the early evening light. The room smelled of bleach and closed air, as if no one had slept there in weeks, but someone had made certain it appeared clean. She set her suitcase on the bed, and then she saw it. On the wall beside the headboard, held in place with strips of yellowed tape, was a photograph. It had been torn in half. The half that remained showed Lily and Noah, arms wrapped around a woman in a white apron, clinging to her with the fierce and uncomplicated grip of children holding on to something they love. Their faces were lit in a way Dorothy had not seen in any of the photos Ethan had texted her over the past several months. But the other half of the photograph had been ripped away. The edges were jagged and violent, as if someone had seized it in anger and pulled. The woman's face was gone. Dorothy reached out and touched the torn edge with the tip of one finger. The tape was old. This photograph had been here a long time, and someone had tried to destroy it, but had not finished the job. Dorothy felt her stomach tighten like a closed fist. Because the woman in the photograph was the previous housekeeper, the one who had been let go months ago, the one whose name the children had quietly stopped mentioning on phone calls. And if someone had torn that photo with that kind of violence, this was not the end of a routine work arrangement. This was something else. Then she heard a sound just outside the door. Light footsteps, quick and deliberate, the footsteps of a child who has learned to move through a hallway without being noticed. Dorothy turned and opened the door. The hallway was empty, but directly in front of her door on the hardwood floor was a folded piece of paper. She picked it up and opened it. It was a drawing done in crayon. A house with black windows. A large figure painted entirely in red, mouth open wide, in what could only be a scream. And in the corner of the page, pressed together two small, colorless figures, as if whoever had drawn them had run out of hope before getting to them, or had decided they did not deserve color. Dorothy leaned against the doorframe and closed her eyes. She pressed Earl's watch through the fabric of her apron until the metal edge left a mark in her palm. And she knew, with the bone-deep certainty that only comes from a lifetime of raising children and watching them grow, that what was happening inside this house was far worse than anything she had allowed herself to imagine before she crossed that gate. The first night, Dorothy did not sleep. She sat on the edge of the single bed in the dark, with Earl's watch turning slowly in her hands the way she used to count rosary beads when Ethan was sick as a little boy. She prayed in a low voice, asking God to give her the patience to keep this disguise a little longer, because every part of her was urging her to climb those stairs, to open the doors, to find Lily and Noah, and hold them until whatever fear lived in this house no longer had room to breathe. But she did not move, because if she revealed herself now, Claire would have an explanation ready before Dorothy could finish a sentence. Ethan would believe his wife from 1,000 miles away, and everything would remain exactly the same. She had to see, she had to understand. She had to collect every detail, like evidence, before she took a single step. At 5 in the morning, she rose, washed her face with cold water at the small bathroom sink, put on a fresh apron, and walked to the kitchen. The house was still dark. Early morning light was just beginning to press through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the dining room, laying long gold rectangles across the dark wood table that gleamed as though it was polished daily. Dorothy started coffee in a large steel espresso machine that probably cost more than her monthly mortgage payment back home. As the coffee brewed, she heard footsteps on the stairs. Light ones, careful ones. The footsteps of someone who has learned to move through a house without drawing attention. Lily appeared in the kitchen doorway. She was 7 years old, but she had the eyes of someone considerably older. Her hair was pulled into a braid so tight it stretched the skin at her temples. She wore a school uniform that had been pressed to perfection. Her shoulders were curved slightly inward, drawn toward her chest, as if she were bracing herself against something she expected to arrive at any moment. Behind her came Noah, 5 years old, smaller than Dorothy expected for his age. He did not speak. He did not look up. He walked to one of the kitchen chairs and sat down with his hands flat on the table, very still, staring at a point on the wall in front of him, as if he had learned that moving too much brought consequences he did not want. "Good morning," Dorothy said, keeping her voice as soft and steady as she could manage. "Can I fix you some breakfast?" Lily looked at her with cautious eyes. "We eat in here," she said quietly. "Mom eats upstairs." Dorothy felt something come apart inside her at the simplicity of that sentence, said without drama, said without any evident awareness that it was unusual, said the way a child says something that has simply become the way things are. She made them scrambled eggs with toast and orange juice. Lily ate slowly, eyes on her plate. Noah barely touched his food. He moved a piece of toast from one side of the plate to the other with the mechanical motion of someone whose mind was somewhere else entirely. Dorothy sat across from them and said nothing. She did not push. She did not ask questions that might frighten them. She waited the way you wait when you understand that trust is something that has to find its own way to the surface. And that was when she saw it. Lily reached across the table for her glass of juice. The sleeve of her uniform slipped back to the elbow. On the inside of her forearm there was a bruise, dark purple at the center, fading to yellow at the edges, the size of a plum. Dorothy had raised a child. She had volunteered at her church's after-school program for 11 years. She knew the difference between a bruise from a fall and a bruise from a hand. Fall bruises show up on knees, on shins, on elbows. Bruises on the soft inside of a forearm come from fingers, from someone who grabs, from someone who pulls. Lily noticed where Dorothy was looking and snapped her arm back. She tugged the sleeve to her wrist in a single practiced motion. "I fell playing outside," she said quickly, in the rehearsed tone of someone who has said those exact words many times before. Dorothy nodded slowly and said nothing, but Noah did something unexpected. Without speaking, he reached into the front pocket of his pants and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. He slid it across the table toward Dorothy, with the tips of his fingers the careful way you might pass a secret note. Dorothy picked it up and opened it. It was another drawing. A kitchen. A table. 2 small figures sitting alone. And at the back of the drawing, separated from them by a thick black crayon line, a woman in a red dress, with her mouth open and hands that were enormous, grotesquely large, out of all proportion with the rest of her body. Her hands were the biggest element in the entire drawing, bigger than her head, bigger than her torso, as if the thing this 5-year-old boy remembered most about this woman was not her face, not her voice, but what her hands did. Dorothy held the drawing and felt the paper trembling slightly. Not from the air conditioning, from her own hands. Lily looked at her brother with wide and frightened eyes. "Noah," she whispered sharply. "Don't." But Noah did not look away from Dorothy. He kept his large, still eyes on her face, and something in them was asking a question he did not yet have language for. Dorothy folded the drawing with care and placed it in her apron pocket beside Earl's watch. "That is a beautiful drawing," she told Noah, keeping her voice warm and level. He did not smile, but something in his eyes shifted slightly, opened a little like a window in a room that has been closed all winter. That morning, Dorothy cleaned the house in silence. She mopped the marble floors, dusted the living room furniture, washed the dishes from the previous night. And as she washed, she counted. 8 dinner plates, 4 wine glasses, 0 children's plates from the dining room. Lily and Noah's dishes were stacked in the kitchen sink, separate from everything else, as if the children's meals belonged to a different category inside their own home. Claire came downstairs at 11. She poured herself a green juice without acknowledging Dorothy and went to the back patio to take a phone call. Through the open kitchen window, Dorothy caught fragments of the conversation. Claire was planning a dinner party for Friday. She was animated and warm, laughing easily, using the light and confident voice of a woman who feels entirely in control of her world. And Dorothy stood at the kitchen sink thinking, this woman can plan a dinner party for 12 people with flawless precision and not know what her own children had for breakfast this morning? That afternoon, Dorothy went out to sweep the front walk. That was when she met Mrs. Helen Patterson, the neighbor from the house next door. A woman in her early 60s with an easy, neighborly manner and the friendly watchfulness of someone who has lived on the same block long enough to know everything that matters. Mrs. Patterson drifted over toward the low decorative fence between the properties. "You are the new one?" Dorothy nodded. "Yes, ma'am. They call me Ruth. The agency sent me." Mrs. Patterson looked at her with an expression that was not curiosity. It was something deeper, something closer to compassion. "God bless you and give you strength, honey," she said quietly. Dorothy stepped a little closer. "Why do you say that?" Mrs. Patterson glanced toward the house, checking that no one was at the windows. "Because the woman who was here before you," she said, lowering her voice, "her name was Grace. She had been with this family for 3 years. Those babies called her Miss Grace and lit up like Christmas morning every time she walked through the door. And then, one day, just like that, overnight, Claire let her go. Told the agency that Grace had stolen a bracelet. But I watched that woman walk out of this house crying, with her things in a garbage bag. And there is no way on God's green earth that Grace took anything that did not belong to her." Dorothy gripped the broom handle with both hands to keep Mrs. Patterson from seeing that she was trembling. "Do you know why Grace was really let go?" Mrs. Patterson's voice dropped even lower. "Because those children loved Grace more than they loved their own mother. And Claire could not stand it. She could not stand seeing Lily run to Grace when she got home from school instead of running to her. She could not stand hearing Noah call Grace Miss Grace with more warmth than he put into the word Mom. And instead of asking herself why, instead of sitting with that question and what it might mean, she simply removed the person who was giving her children love, as if taking away the source of warmth would force the warmth to redirect itself. Dorothy stood very still. The late afternoon sun was pressing against the back of her neck, and the children, she said, how were they after Grace left? Mrs. Patterson crossed herself. Lily stopped talking to people outside the house. Noah stopped talking altogether. You used to hear those two out in this yard squealing and running around. Now this whole block goes quiet when you walk past that house. It is like someone turned off the sound on those two sweet babies. Dorothy thanked Mrs. Patterson with a nod because she did not trust her own voice at that moment. She walked back inside, closed the front door, and pressed her back against the wall of the hallway. Her heart was knocking against her ribs with the force of something trying to break through. Her grandchildren were living with fear. They ate their meals alone. They had lost the only warm presence in that house. And her son, Ethan, the boy she had raised on home-cooked food and late-night prayers and every ounce of love she could give, had no idea. Because he was somewhere in another city closing another deal he had convinced himself was the most important thing in the world. Dorothy reached into her apron pocket and unfolded Noah's drawing. She stared at the enormous red hands. She stared at the two colorless figures tucked into the corner, and she made a decision. She was going to stay. She was going to see everything. She was going to document every detail, and when she had enough, she was going to do what no housekeeper could do, but a mother could. She was going to force her son to open his eyes. Friday arrived the way days you dread always arrive, with a kind of slow, unhurried certainty. Dorothy spent the morning preparing the house for the dinner party Claire had been planning all week. She polished the silver until each fork and spoon reflected the chandelier overhead like a tiny mirror. She pressed the white linen tablecloths until not a single crease remained. She arranged the floral centerpieces that had been delivered that morning, red and white roses in tall crystal vases that filled the entryway with a perfume so heavy it made Dorothy's eyes sting. Claire supervised every detail with the precision of a surgeon. She moved a wine glass 2 inches to the left. She swapped out a charger plate over a streak visible only to her. She tasted the wine and said nothing. In 6 hours of preparation, she did not once ask where Lily and Noah were. Dorothy knew. She had watched them go upstairs after lunch. Lily leading her younger brother by the hand, the way a mother would guide a child, though Lily herself was still a child. Noah carrying his box of crayons the way other children carry a stuffed animal. And Dorothy could not stop wondering how many evenings those two had spent upstairs with the door closed, while their mother entertained downstairs, performing the role of the perfect wife for people who would never see anything else. The guests began arriving at 7. Men in sport coats and women in dresses that cost more than Dorothy's car. Claire received each of them at the door with a smile that transformed her face entirely, as if she had slipped on a second skin made of ease and warmth and practiced elegance. She kissed cheeks and squeezed hands, and spoke of Ethan's absence as though it were a mark of distinction rather than a symptom of something broken. "My husband is closing a major deal in New York," she said with soft, rehearsed pride. "He insisted I go ahead and host." He did not want to disappoint everyone. The guests smiled and nodded. Dorothy moved through the dining room with trays and pitchers, invisible, the way certain people in certain rooms are expected to remain invisible. Every word Claire spoke was another coat of lacquer over something that had long since begun to rot underneath. The dinner began. Dorothy served each course a butternut squash bisque, a beef tenderloin with a red wine reduction, a roasted vegetable medley that smelled extraordinary. The conversation flowed easily from real estate to private school applications to a ski trip someone was planning for February, all discussed with the casual confidence of people for whom scarcity is entirely theoretical. Dorothy moved between kitchen and dining room, steady and quiet. And then she made a mistake. Claire had specified a particular Cabernet Sauvignon to be poured with the main course. Dorothy picked up the open bottle nearest the wine station and began serving. But it was the Pinot Grigio from the first course, pale and wrong. She realized it halfway through the second glass, when the color in the crystal caught the chandelier light in a way that was entirely off. Before she could correct it, Claire's voice cut across the dining room like something sharp. "What are you doing?" Every utensil stopped. 12 pairs of eyes found Dorothy, who stood at the end of the table with a bottle in her hand and a small drip of white wine on the front of her apron. Claire rose from her chair slowly. Her red dress moved around her like a flame. She walked toward Dorothy with measured, deliberate steps, heels marking each one against the marble. "I told you the Cabernet with the main course. I told you specifically 3 times. Are you not listening, or do you simply not understand?" The words landed the way certain words do, not loudly, but precisely. Dorothy felt the heat rise from her chest to her face, a dry and spreading heat that had nothing to do with the temperature in the room. It was the heat of being humiliated in front of strangers by a woman who had no idea she was humiliating the mother of her own husband. "I am so sorry, ma'am," Dorothy said, lowering her gaze. "I picked up the wrong bottle. It will not happen again." Claire stopped a foot away from her and looked down with an expression that was not anger. Anger is too human for what it was. This was something colder, It was contempt. The still settled contempt of someone who has decided that another person does not warrant basic dignity. "You can do better than that," Claire said, her voice low and controlled, like someone giving instructions to a child who needs to be corrected carefully. "Apologize properly. On your knees." A murmur moved through the table. One woman raised her wine glass to her lips as a place to hide her face. A man in a charcoal blazer shifted his gaze toward the window. But no one said anything. No one stood up. No one opened their mouth to say that this was wrong, that you do not treat a person this way over a wine bottle. Not in front of guests. Not ever. Dorothy looked at Claire directly for one long, silent moment. And in that moment, she saw everything she needed to see. She saw the woman who raised her voice at her grandchildren for ordinary mistakes. She saw the woman who had removed grace from their lives for the unforgivable crime of being loved. She saw the woman who performed warmth for dinner guests and withheld it from the two small people who needed it most. And underneath all of that, she saw something that chilled her in a way she had not anticipated. She saw a woman who needed others on their knees to feel like she was standing on solid ground. Dorothy lowered herself to one knee, then the other. The marble was cold and unyielding against her bones. "I apologize, ma'am," she said, her voice clear and steady, her eyes directed at the floor. "It will not happen again." Claire stood over her for 3 seconds. 3 seconds that stretched far beyond what 3 seconds should contain. Then she turned, returned to her chair, and resumed the conversation, as if nothing had occurred. "The correct wine, please," she said without looking back. Dorothy rose from the floor. Her knees ached, her pride ached. The knowledge that she was in her own son's home, that this woman had put her on her knees in her own family's house without knowing who she was putting on her knees, that ache was something different from all the others. But she did not remove the apron. Not yet. She went to the kitchen, pressed both palms flat against the cool granite countertop, and breathed. Once, twice, 3 times, until the trembling in her arms settled just enough to pick up the correct bottle and walk back into the dining room with steady hands and a face that revealed nothing at all. The guests left after 10. Claire went upstairs without saying good night. Dorothy washed the dinner dishes, 12 plates, 12 wine glasses, each bearing a lipstick mark on the rim. 0 children's plates, because once again Lily and Noah had not eaten in the dining room. Dorothy had carried plates of pasta upstairs to them at 8 o'clock. She had found them sitting together on the floor of Lily's bedroom with the lights off, pressed close, small and silent, like 2 creatures waiting out a storm that had not yet passed. The house settled into quiet. Dorothy finished cleaning and walked down the hallway toward the staff room. But before she reached it, she heard something. A whisper, barely there, soft as the wing beat of a moth. "Ruth." Dorothy stopped. The voice came from the direction of the children's room, whose door was slightly open. She walked toward it and leaned carefully into the doorway. Lily was sitting on the edge of her bed, with her legs hanging off the side and her hands pressed flat on her knees. Her eyes were open and dry. They were the eyes of a child who has learned at some point that crying does not change anything. "Please don't leave too," she whispered. "Please." Dorothy felt the floor move beneath her. She crossed the room, crouched down in front of Lily, and took both of the girl's hands in her own. They were cold. She looked into her granddaughter's eyes with every ounce of love she had been holding back since the moment she crossed that iron gate. "I am not going anywhere," she said. "I promise you." Lily searched her face for a long moment, looking for the lie, the way children look who have been disappointed enough times to know that the lie is usually there. And then she fell forward. She pressed herself against Dorothy's chest, and held on with the thin and fierce arms of a child who has not been properly held in far too long. Dorothy wrapped both arms around her and closed her eyes. The tears she had been holding for 5 long days ran silently down her cheeks, warm and steady, soaking into the neckline of her apron, while her granddaughter held on without knowing she was holding her grandmother. A small sound made them both look up. Noah was standing in the doorway barefoot, holding a piece of paper. He walked toward them in his careful and deliberate way and extended the drawing toward Dorothy with both hands. She took it with the arm that was not holding Lily. She looked at it, and the tears that were already falling came harder. It was a woman with silver hair and a gray apron. She was smiling. It was the first time Noah had ever drawn someone smiling. Dorothy waited until Saturday morning to make the call. Claire had left early for her Saturday yoga class. The children were in their room, with the door closed. Dorothy locked herself in the staff room, reached under the mattress for the phone she had hidden there on the first day, and dialed Ethan's number. It rang 4 times. His voice came to her from somewhere distant, distracted with the background noise of an airport layered behind it. "Mom, this is not a great time. I am about to board a flight to New York." Dorothy closed her eyes and pressed the phone against her ear. "Ethan, I need you to come home. To the house. This is urgent, and it is about your family." Silence from his end of the line. Dorothy knew that silence. It was the silence Ethan made when something pulled him out of his professional world and forced him to think about things he would rather not think about. Is something wrong? Are the kids okay? Dorothy measured each word with the care of someone walking across ice. "The children are okay, but I need you to see something in person. I cannot explain this over the phone." "It matters, Ethan. It matters more than whatever meeting you have scheduled." The words my son nearly escaped before she caught them, and she pressed her lips together because that tone did not belong to the voice of a hired housekeeper named Ruth. But Ethan did not notice. He was too deep inside his calendar to catch the edges of things. "I will try to get there Friday night," he said. "Saturday morning at the very latest. Can it wait until then?" Dorothy did the math. 6 more days. 6 more days of polished silverware and empty dining rooms and children eating dinner alone on bedroom floors. "Yes," she said. "It can wait. But come, Ethan. Come without telling anyone you are coming. Come straight to the house." A longer silence. Without telling Claire, she pressed her hand around Earl's watch in her pocket. "Without calling ahead to anyone, just trust me." Ethan let out a long breath. An overhead announcement of a departing flight leaked through from his end of the call. "All right, Mom, I will be there." Dorothy hung up and sat on the edge of the staff room bed with the phone between her hands, looking at the torn photograph still taped to the wall. 6 days. She had 6 days to gather everything she needed. And the first thing she needed was to find Grace. That same afternoon, while Claire was upstairs with her phone and the children were in their room, Dorothy told Claire she needed to run to the drugstore for a cleaning supply that had run out. Claire waved her off without turning around. "You have 1 hour." Dorothy walked to the nearest bus stop and rode south across the city to East Point, a neighborhood where the air smelled of late summer and front porch cooking, where people lived their lives in the open rather than behind iron gates. Small houses with lived-in front stoops, kids on bicycles, someone's grandmother in a lawn chair waving at passing cars. She found the address Mrs. Patterson had described and knocked on a blue door 1 block from the community church. Grace opened it. She was a woman in her early 50s with calloused and capable hands, hair pulled neatly back, and eyes that carried the specific exhaustion of someone who has been fighting a low-grade grief for months without resolution. She looked at Dorothy with a cautious and measuring expression. Dorothy introduced herself as Ruth the new housekeeper at the Calloway house. She told Grace she had seen how the children were living. She told her she knew what had been done to her and that she wanted to help. Grace studied her with a blend of surprise and distrust that Dorothy understood completely. When someone has spent months being treated as guilty of something they did not do, distrust becomes the only protection they have left. "With respect, ma'am," Grace said without releasing the door, "I have no desire to have anything to do with that house again. She took my job. She told the agency I stole. And now no one will hire me because one phone call from one woman is all it takes to close every door in front of you." She paused, and her voice, when it continued, was firm but fractured at its edges, like a wall that is holding but has cracks running through it. That woman yelled at those children for everything. If Lily spilled her juice, she grabbed the child's arm and called her clumsy. If Noah cried, she told him, "Boys do not cry," and sent him to his room without dinner. I used to hold them when she was not looking. I read to them in the kitchen after Claire had gone to bed. I made them hot cocoa when they woke up from bad dreams, and when Claire figured out that those children came to me before they came to her, she did not ask herself why. She just made me disappear. Grace looked down at her hands resting in her lap. She invented the story about the bracelet called The Agency and had me out of that house in 20 minutes with a garbage bag for my things. She did not even let me say goodbye to them. She stopped. Her voice had become very thin. The last thing I saw was Lily standing at the upstairs window, watching me walk to my car. She was not crying. She was not making any sound. She was just watching. And that was worse than any sound she could have made. Dorothy reached into her apron pocket and brought out the 3 drawings Noah had made during the week she had been in the house. She unfolded them on the kitchen table, one beside the other. The house with black windows, the enormous red hands, the silver-haired woman who was smiling. Grace looked at the drawings and her eyes went wet immediately, because she recognized the style. She recognized the way Noah made hands bigger than heads, because hands were the most important thing in the world to him. The hands that held him, the hands that frightened him, the hands that told the full story he could not yet tell with words. "That child," Grace said softly, touching the edge of the paper with one finger. "He used to draw flowers and dogs when I was there. Happy things, bright colors. He once drew me with angel wings." Dorothy took Grace's hand and held it with both of hers. "Things are going to change," she said. "I give you my word." Grace studied her face, looking for the emptiness that lives inside promises made by people who say kind things and then disappear. "Ma'am," she said, after a moment, "you seem like a good woman. But that house, nobody changes anything in that house. She has everyone convinced. Her husband believes she is perfect because she performs it convincingly enough. The neighbors stay quiet. Anyone who speaks up gets flattened. That is how it has worked, and that is how it keeps working." Dorothy stood up. She adjusted the kerchief on her silver hair. She looked at Grace with an expression that was not the expression of a woman named Ruth who worked for an agency. It was the expression of a woman who had buried her husband and raised a son alone, and walked through that iron gate with nothing but an apron, an Earl's pocket watch, and an absolute refusal to let her grandchildren grow up the way they were growing up. "I am not who you think I am, Grace," she said quietly. "And when the time comes, I will show you. But right now, I am asking you to trust me." "Can you do that?" Grace did not say yes, but she did not say no, and Dorothy understood that for now, that was enough. The 6 days moved slowly, the way time moves when you are counting every hour. Dorothy cleaned and served and obeyed. Each evening, she locked herself in the staff room with the drawings and the notes she had been keeping in a small notebook from her suitcase. Lily and Noah began finding her in the kitchen, before Claire came downstairs each morning. They did not always talk. Lily would share quiet things in a low voice. A sticker a classmate had given her, a song they learned in music class. Sebastian Noah would sit beside Dorothy while she cooked and draw in his sketchbook, and every few minutes he would lift the paper toward her, saying nothing, simply waiting for her nod. She always nodded. Every single drawing, every single time, because each one was a sentence he could not yet say out loud, and she was not going to leave a single one unanswered. Saturday arrived with October sunlight warming the stone walkways of the house from early morning. Claire had organized a formal family lunch for that afternoon. Her mother was driving up from Charlotte. An aunt, 2 cousins and their husbands, and several family friends Claire considered important would all be there. Dorothy prepared the dining room with the same precision she brought to every task in that house. White linens, silver placed perfectly, crystal water glasses without a single smudge, fresh flowers in tall arrangements, everything impeccable, everything curated. Everything designed to create an impression of a family that had it all. She watched Claire come down the staircase in the red dress. That red dress, the same one from Noah's drawings. The one that had become in the inner world of a 5-year-old boy the uniform of everything that frightened him. The guests arrived. Embraces and perfume and the comfortable noise of people who gathered regularly and knew each other's rhythms. Claire moved through the room with her social warmth fully operational, speaking of Ethan's career with admiration that sounded genuine to everyone present except the woman carrying the breadbasket. Lily and Noah were seated together at the far end of the table. Lily's spine straight, hands below the table, braced. Noah, eyes on his plate, not eating. Dorothy circulated between kitchen and dining room, carrying, serving, clearing, invisible, the way certain people in certain rooms are always expected to be. And then it happened. She was carrying a tray of dessert plates when the toe of her shoe caught the edge of the dining room rug. The tray tilted. One plate slid off the edge and hit the marble floor with a sound like a small gunshot that stopped every conversation at once. Claire set her wineglass on the table with a movement that looked calm. Dorothy recognized that kind of calm. It was the stillness before the weather breaks, the held breath before the strike. Claire pushed back her chair and stood. She walked toward Dorothy with measured steps, the kind of walk that makes use of an audience heels marking each footfall against the marble. She stopped above Dorothy, who was crouching and gathering the broken pieces from the floor. "What is the matter with you?" Claire said. Her voice was not raised. It was something worse than raised. It was precise and cold and controlled. "You cannot do a single thing properly. I ask one thing of you, one." Dorothy looked up from the floor. Claire stood over her in the red dress, arms folded, jaw set. And beyond her, at the far end of the table, Dorothy saw Lily. The girl's face had gone white. Her eyes were locked on her mother with the frozen, wide-open expression of a child who knows exactly what comes after that particular tone of voice. Claire bent down, picked up one of the remaining dessert plates from the tray, and brought it down hard against the marble floor at Dorothy's feet. The pieces scattered. A shard caught the web of skin between Dorothy's thumb and forefinger. A thin line of blood appeared and opened. "Clean it up," Claire said, "with your hands." A sound moved through the table. Claire's mother looked down at her plate. The cousins exchanged a glance that was not shock. It was the glance of people who have seen this before and have chosen again to look the other way. Everyone at that table had seen some version of this, and everyone had chosen the same silence. Dorothy reached for a piece of the broken plate on the floor. And that was when a voice came from the doorway of the dining room, a voice she had not heard once during all the time she had been in this house. a voice she had known longer than any other voice in her life, because she had been the one who first taught it to speak. What is happening here? Ethan stood in the entryway, travel jacket still on, carry-on bag still in his hand. He had come early. He had come in without calling ahead. He had done exactly what his mother had asked him to do. And he had seen everything. Claire turned toward him with the speed of someone caught in the act, and then immediately began to reconstruct her composure. "Ethan, sweetheart," she said, her smile clicking into place, "we were not expecting you until tonight." He did not look at her. He looked at the woman crouching on the floor of his dining room, with blood on her hand and broken china scattered around her knees. He looked at her the way you look at something familiar from an unfamiliar angle when recognition is arriving slowly but cannot be stopped. Dorothy stood up from the floor. Her knee ached from the night Claire had put her on it in the same room. Her hand ached from the cut. But neither of those things mattered anymore. She wiped her hand on her apron. She reached up and untied the kerchief from her silver hair and let it fall away. She removed the apron, folded it with unhurried and steady hands, and laid it on the table. Claire stared at her without understanding. The guests stared at her without understanding. Only Ethan, standing in the doorway with his bag still in his hand, had begun to understand. Because the silver hair that appeared was his mother's hair. The face that appeared was his mother's face. And the eyes that looked across the dining room at him were the same eyes that had been looking at him his entire life, with a love that had never once required anything in return. "I am not Ruth," Dorothy said. Her voice was clear. It did not waver. She looked at Claire directly. "My name is Dorothy Calloway. I am Ethan's mother, and I have spent the past week watching with my own eyes how you treat my grandchildren and anyone you consider beneath you." The silence that fell over that dining room was the heaviest silence Dorothy had experienced in her 68 years. Heavier than the hospital the night they told her about Earl. Heavier than the silence of coming home to an empty house for the first time as a widow. It was the silence of something that cannot be unsaid, something that cannot be unseen. Claire's mother covered her mouth. The cousins sat frozen with their glasses halfway to their lips. Claire's face drained of color, as if someone had opened a drain somewhere. And then the silence broke. It broke not with an adult word, but with a child's voice, high and desperate, and 8 years old, and full of everything that had been contained too long inside a body too small to hold it. "Grandma." Lily came out of her chair at the end of the table. She ran across the dining room, sidestepping the broken china the way a child sidesteps obstacles she has learned to navigate, and threw herself at Dorothy with both arms open. She hit her at full speed, her face already wet, tears arriving before the words did, because the tears had been waiting much longer than any words had. Dorothy caught her, held her with both arms, the bleeding hand pressed against her granddaughter's back, leaving a faint red mark on the fabric of the girl's dress that neither of them noticed or would have cared about if they had. Grandma Lily said again and again, as if she were teaching her own mouth to believe the word was real. "Grandma. Grandma." Noah did not run. Noah never ran. He climbed down from his chair and walked around the end of the table in his careful and measured way, a small 5-year-old navigating a world that had just shifted on its axis until he reached Dorothy. He did not speak. He pressed himself against her side and wrapped both arms around her leg and held on with the quiet and absolute grip of someone who has found solid ground and intends to stay there. Ethan set down his carry-on bag. The sound of it hitting the marble floor echoed through the room like a period at the end of a very long sentence. And Dorothy looked at her son's face and saw something she had never seen there before. It was the face of a man discovering that the life he thought he was living had been something else entirely. that the truth had been waiting for him here in his own home, in his own dining room, wearing an apron and bleeding from a cut on her hand. The guests left without ceremony. No warm goodbyes, no compliments on the food. They filed out one by one with their eyes toward the floor, the way people leave a place where they have witnessed something they would rather not have seen. Claire's mother was the last to go. She paused in the entryway and turned back to look at her daughter. Her expression was one Dorothy recognized immediately, because it was the same expression Claire used when she looked at her own children. It was not worry. It was not love. It was the careful calculation of someone assessing damage and estimating what it will cost. "Do not call me until you have this sorted out," she said to Claire, and walked out the door. Dorothy settled onto the large sofa in the living room, with Lily still pressed against her side and Noah still holding her leg. She did not make either of them let go. As the last guests filtered past the doorway and out into the October afternoon, she simply sat and held her grandchildren and let herself breathe for the first time in a week. From behind the closed door of Ethan's study, she could hear her son's voice. He was not shouting. Ethan had never been a shouter. But his voice carried a precision it did not usually carry. The precision of a man who is containing something very large and choosing to convert it into exact words because the alternative is something he cannot afford. "You are going to tell me everything," he said, "from the beginning. Because my mother spent more than a week living in this house disguised as a housekeeper. And if she was willing to do that, then what is happening in this house is serious enough that a 68-year-old woman felt she had no other way to make me see it." Claire sat in the chair across from him, with her hands flat on her knees. The red dress that had commanded every room it entered today now looked like a costume that had outlived its usefulness. Her eyes were swollen, but she was not crying. She looked at the floor with her jaws set, the posture of someone whose shelter has just come down and who has not yet decided how to exist without it. Ethan placed 3 drawings on the desk between them. He had gotten them from Dorothy before she went to sit with the children. He spread them one at a time on the surface in front of her. The house with the black windows, the enormous red hands, the woman with silver hair who was smiling. "Your son is 5 years old, and he does not speak," Ethan said, gesturing at the drawings. "He does not speak, and this is what he draws. This is what he is carrying inside him. Did you know this?" Claire looked at the drawings, and something changed in her face. The tension in her jaw shifted. Her lips moved without producing sound, as if the words were lodged somewhere between her chest and her throat. Ethan continued, "My mother saw that our daughter has a bruise on her arm that did not come from falling. She watched our children eat every meal alone in the kitchen while you hosted dinners in the dining room. She spoke to our neighbor, who told her how you dismissed Grace with a false report to the agency. And an hour ago, in front of your family and mine, I watched you throw a plate at my mother's feet and tell her to pick up the pieces with her bare hands." Claire closed her eyes. When she opened them, what was behind them was not what had been there before. The composed surface was gone. The lacquered finish that had held all week was gone. What remained underneath was something Ethan had not anticipated. It was fear, old and deep and entirely unrelated to anything that had just happened in the dining room. It was the fear of a girl. "I do not know how to do it any differently," Claire said, barely above a whisper. Her voice had become something she was struggling to hold together. "My mother raised me this way. If I spilled something, she grabbed my arm and sat me in a corner without dinner. If I cried, she told me I was weak and that no one would want a weak girl. If I brought home a bad grade, she would not speak to me for days. That was the only language I was taught, Ethan. That was the only vocabulary I was given." She looked down at her hands resting open in her lap as if she were seeing them from outside herself. When Lily was born, I told myself I would be different. I promised myself. But every time Lily made a mistake, the only thing that came out of me was my mother's voice, her words, her hands, the same hands, and I hate myself for it. But I do not know how to stop it. From the hallway, Dorothy stood very still, because what she had just heard through that door was not an excuse. It was a confession. The confession of a cycle, of someone who repeats what was done to them, not because they choose to, but because cruelty was the only mother tongue they were ever taught. That did not excuse anything, but it made it human. Ethan sat down across from his wife. He did not touch her. He did not offer consolation, but he did not attack her either. "Here is what is going to happen," he said. His voice was controlled and without cruelty. "You are going to see a therapist this week. Not next month, not when you feel ready, this week. I will find someone qualified and you will go every week, without exception." Claire nodded without raising her eyes from the floor. "If in 6 months I do not see real change, not performance, not the appearance of change, but actual change, I will file for divorce and pursue full custody of the children." That is not a threat. That is what will happen. Claire nodded again. The tears that had held back through the entire confrontation were coming now, silently, in thin tracks down her face that she did not bother to stop. "And one more thing," Ethan said. "Grace is coming back." Claire looked up sharply. "Grace comes back to this house," Ethan repeated, "with a proper employment contract, with fair pay, with health benefits, and with the basic respect she should have received from the beginning. And you are going to apologize to her, not a polished apology, a real one, looking her in the eye, saying exactly what you did and why it was wrong." Claire said nothing, but she did not say no. Ethan came out of the study and found his mother on the sofa with both children asleep against her. He sat down beside her and looked at her for a long time without speaking. Dorothy reached up and put her palm gently against her son's face, the hand with the cut wrapped in a napkin that Lily had tied there before falling asleep. And she said the only thing a mother can say when her son looks at her with a face that is trying very hard not to come apart. "I am right here, sweetheart. I am right here." The next morning, Dorothy went back to East Point. She knocked on the blue door. Grace opened it with the same guarded expression she had worn at their first meeting. But when she saw Dorothy's face, something in her eyes shifted. Dorothy told her everything, who she was, what she had done, what had happened in the dining room, what Ethan had said to Claire in the study, what was going to happen next. Grace listened without interrupting, hands folded on the table, eyes getting wider with each thing she heard. When Dorothy finished, Grace sat in silence for nearly a full minute. "You dressed up as a housekeeper," she said finally, as if she needed to hear it spoken to believe it was real. "You, the mother of Ethan Calloway, put on an apron and cleaned floors, and let that woman put you on your knees?" Dorothy nodded. "Because it was the only way my son could see the truth." Grace stood up slowly. She walked to the framed print she kept on her kitchen wall, a sunlit field with a verse printed underneath, and she pressed her hand flat against it. "Thank God," she said, and her voice was trembling. "Thank God for people who love like that." That same afternoon, Grace walked through the front door of the house in Buckhead. Not the service entrance, the front door. Dorothy walked beside her the way you accompany someone who has been wrongly taken from a place and is returning to reclaim what was theirs. When Lily saw Grace standing in the living room, she went completely still for 3 full seconds, as if her body needed a moment to accept that what she was seeing was real and not something she had imagined. Then she ran. She crossed the living room at full speed and crashed into Grace with both arms wide open. And the sound she made was not a word, it was a name, just one name. The name of someone she had been missing for months. Miss Grace. Grace held her and did not let go, and neither did Lily. And they stayed there for a long time, both of them crying without any attempt to stop it. The way people cry when they believed they had lost each other and turned out to be wrong. Noah walked slowly across the room. He stopped beside them, looked up, and raised both arms, and for the first time in many months he was lifted without having to ask, through a drawing. 1 year later, the house sounded different. Dorothy noticed it the very first Sunday she came back after everything had changed. And she kept noticing it every Sunday after that, arriving at 10 in the morning with her canvas grocery bag full of rosemary and garlic and the good cut of beef her mother had always used, the pot roast recipe passed down through 3 generations of women whose names she was still learning to trace. A recipe she was now teaching Lily in a kitchen that no longer smelled of bleach and closed rooms, but of something warm and alive. The first change was the sound. Where there had been silence, there was noise, the noise of children who were not trying to disappear. The sound of Lily calling out from the backyard, "Miss Grace, come look what I found." The sound of Grace laughing from the kitchen in response, easy and unhurried. Lily no longer flinched at sudden sounds. She no longer walked with her shoulders pulled up toward her ears. She no longer sat at tables with her hands hidden below the surface. She ran through the yard now with her hair loose because one afternoon she had told Claire she did not want it braided tight anymore. And Claire, using the breathing technique her therapist had been teaching her for exactly these moments, had said, "Okay, honey, whatever you want." 4 words. They had cost Claire more than anything she had ever done in her life, because they ran against everything she had been taught. Because they meant placing her daughter's preference above her own reflex to control, and she had said them anyway. Noah was talking. Not constantly, not the way some children his age talk from the moment they open their eyes until they close them again, but he was talking. He asked for things with words. He said good morning when he came downstairs. He said thank you when Grace set his plate in front of him, and once one single time that Dorothy would carry with her for the rest of her life, he came and stood beside her while she was making biscuits at the kitchen counter, and said, "Grandma, can you show me how to do that?" She had to turn toward the stove so he would not see her cry. But Noah kept drawing. That did not change. What changed were the drawings. No more houses with black windows. No more figures in red with mouths open in screams. Now he drew dogs with enormous floppy ears and expressions that made you want to laugh. Trees covered in fruit that came in colors not found in nature. Families. Many families. Families where everyone had closed mouths and regular-sized hands and smiles that were almost too large for the page. Grace worked in the house with the dignity she had always deserved. Claire had given her the apology Ethan required, looking her in the eye, saying exactly what she had done and why it had been wrong. The first weeks between them had been tense. The kind of tense that comes when too much has happened and the wound is still close. But slowly what grew between them was not friendship and not false warmth. It was respect, fragile and deliberate and built one day at a time, held together because both women chose to hold it. On Sundays, Grace sat at the dining room table with the family. Not every day, but Sundays when Dorothy came to cook when Ethan was home, Grace was there. And sometimes Claire was too still uncomfortable, but staying anyway because her therapist had told her that discomfort is not a sign that something is wrong. It is a sign that something is changing. Claire had not become a different person. therapy does not work that way. 12 months cannot undo 30 years of damage at the root. But she was eating dinner with the children every night now at the kitchen table. It was hard. You could see it in the way she held her shoulders. In the long pauses when Lily said something and Claire did not immediately know how to respond with warmth because no one had ever shown her what that looked like from the inside of a family. But she was there. She was present. She was trying, and for Dorothy for now, that was enough. On a Sunday in September, Ethan came and sat beside his mother on the bench in the backyard. The children were playing with Grace among the roses along the back fence. The smell of pot roast and rosemary drifted through the open kitchen window and filled the warm afternoon air with something that resembled happiness more closely than anything this yard had held before. Dorothy had Earl's watch in her hand, turning it in her fingers, the case worn smooth from years of holding it in exactly this way. She had been thinking about the day she would pass it to Noah. Ethan was quiet for a while. He watched his children with the expression of a man who has learned to see something he did not previously know how to look at. "Mom," he said finally. Dorothy looked at him. He took his time finding the words. "I spent years disguised as a successful businessman," he said. "I put on the suit and the watch and the office and the car and convinced myself that was the whole story, the whole point of everything. And you disguised yourself as a housekeeper to save us. You put on an apron and cleaned floors and let a woman put you on your knees. In your own son's house." Dorothy said nothing and waited, because she could hear that he was not finished. "The difference," Ethan said, and his voice caught on the last word, "is that what you did actually mattered." Dorothy took his hand and held it, the way she had held Grace's hand in that East Point kitchen, the way she had held Lily against her chest the night the truth came into the open, the way she had held herself together in that cold staff room and refused to stop. The hand of a 68-year-old woman who had no corporate title, no portfolio, no institutional power, who had nothing really except the absolute and unwavering willingness to go to her knees for the people she loved, and it had been enough to change everything. One Sunday at noon, the smell of pot roast and rosemary filled every room of that house in Buckhead. In the kitchen, Grace was pulling rolls from the oven. In the dining room, Ethan was setting the table himself, something that would have been unimaginable a year before in the life of a man who had never known where the water glasses were kept in his own home. In the backyard, Noah sat cross-legged in the grass with his new set of crayons, drawing in the warm October sun. Dorothy was in her chair by the kitchen window, the chair Ethan had driven to Tennessee to collect specifically for her, because he wanted her to have her own seat at this table every Sunday for as long as she was willing to come. She was not praying. She was watching. She watched Grace move through the kitchen with the ease of someone who belongs there. She watched Ethan carry the water pitcher to the dining room with a small, quiet satisfaction on his face, like a man reconnecting with something he had forgotten he needed. She watched Claire come into the kitchen and ask Grace if she could help with anything. She watched Grace say yes, without warmth, without coldness, simply, "Yes, you can carry the salad in." And she watched Lily come through the kitchen doorway carrying a dish with both hands extended, very carefully, her eyes lit with the particular pride of a child who has done something for the first time and wants to be witnessed in it. "I did it myself," Grandma Lily said, setting the dish in front of Dorothy with exaggerated delicacy, as if she were delivering something precious. "I made the whole thing." Dorothy looked at the dish. The pot roast was not perfect, a little overdone around the edges, a little light on the seasoning, but it was her recipe, the one her mother had taught her, which her mother's mother had taught her mother, a chain of hands reaching back through time to a beginning she could no longer see. And now that chain had reached these two small, flour-dusted hands belonging to a girl who was smiling without fear. Dorothy kissed Lily's forehead. "It is perfect, sweetheart," she said. And Lily smiled, with her whole face, a smile so wide it seemed too large for one person to contain. Noah came in from the yard at a run, stopped at the kitchen doorway to catch his breath, and held a drawing out toward Dorothy with both hands. She took it, and what she saw in it made her press Earl's watch against her palm until the metal edge left an impression in her skin. It was a family, a complete one. In the center, a woman with silver hair in a gray apron. Beside her, a tall man in a jacket painted gray. Nearby, a woman in a red dress who was not screaming. Her mouth was closed. Her hands were small and regular, the size of hands that belonged to a person. Two children whose smiles were so wide they exceeded the edges of their faces, and to one side a woman in a white apron with hands that were the right size, not enormous and frightening, not the hands from the earlier drawings, just the right size, the exact size of hands that hold. Dorothy held the drawing for a long time. Outside, October light came through the kitchen window and fell across her silver hair and Earl's watch and the paper that a 6-year-old boy had made and given to her without needing any words to explain what it meant. Inside, the sound of plates going to the table and voices moving easily through the rooms, unhurried and unafraid, filled the house from the kitchen to the yard. And Dorothy knew, with the certainty that only comes from living something that changes you all the way down to your foundation, that sometimes you have to go to your knees to find the truth. That a mother's love has no disguise strong enough to conceal it for long. And that the truth, given enough time and enough love and enough willingness to stay, always finds its way into the light. Because there are things that no apron, no kerchief, and no silence can keep hidden forever.